The regular resident waterfowl season in North Dakota opens September 21st. We are visiting with waterfowl biologist Mike Szymanski to talk about what hunters can expect and a couple of changes this year. I'm Mike Anderson with the North Dakota Game and Fish Department.
Well, we've had an interesting couple of years here with a couple of very wet springs, the last two coming out of winter. However, this spring was much different where we really didn't have a lot of snowpack around the state, and coming out of winter, spring sprung early, or so it seemed, in March, and it was very dry. So we had a lot of birds migrating by during that time period, which didn't bode well. But rains did start in April and kind of got things rebounded pretty quickly. Our wetland index this year was fairly low, despite getting some of the rain. Our wetland index this year was the 32nd highest out of 77 years. But of course, rains kept coming throughout May and June especially, with some areas receiving almost 200% normal precip. So we had a hard time settling ducks because they were migrating through as conditions were pretty dry but improving. Our duck index was down about 15% from the previous year and was our 30th highest out of 77 years. So we're seeing some lower numbers, you know, relative to the last 30 years when conditions have been really good in North Dakota for breeding ducks. You know, as I said, the conditions in wetlands continued to improve through spring. However, with it being so dry as migration was coming through, it really affected settling patterns of ducks. And we saw that on some of our brood routes, especially for early nesting species like mallards and pintails. Those birds had migrated through before wetland conditions had greatly improved in the state. So we counted a lot of wetlands on our July duck brood surveys. In fact, our wetland index was actually 20% higher than it has been for kind of the last 30-year period when conditions have been pretty wet in the state. However, our brood index was down 59% from last year when we really had good conditions last year for duck broods. This year, not so much despite the wetness. So last year we had really kind of Goldilocks conditions for breeding ducks as far as moisture conditions went. You know, we came out of spring wet, had a pretty, you know, even keeled summer for precip, and production was quite good last year for ducks. But this year, that was not the case. We had just a lot of torrential downpours, heavy rain. Wetland conditions were good, but a lot of ducks had already moved through in migration. And you know, the other problem we have with how the precip occurred was that when you have torrential downpours like that, a lot of our remaining grass in the state is in lower lying areas, and we don't often talk about duck nests getting flooded out. You know, they are actually nesting in upland habitats, but this year, just the way everything played out, we think that could have played a factor in reducing duck production overall, as our duck index was quite low on the brood survey. So all in all, our fall flight index based on our May pair survey and our July duck brood survey was down 36% from last year, and is our 36th highest out of 60 years of a fall flight index. So wetland conditions and grassland conditions this year rebounded quite a bit after drying up considerably from last fall. However, much of that was too late for nesting, settling ducks this year. The good news is that our wetland conditions throughout the eastern half of the state, and especially north of the interstate and in the far southeast part of the state, are in really good shape. And those conditions will set us up good for production next year. That water will carry over, and we should start out next spring with pretty good wetland conditions in a big part of the state. So despite losing a lot of grass, we are set up good moisture-wise in a big portion of the state. Conditions in Canada are still struggling a little bit. They got some moisture this summer, kind of like we did, not to the same extent, but same kind of thing happened where it was quite dry coming out of winter, and a lot of ducks went by breeding areas into the boreal forest. So we're not expecting much of a a good fall flight out of the prairies of Canada this year, unfortunately, but we do expect that later production was probably pretty good. We did some late supplemental duck brood surveys in August and actually had really good late production, especially from mallards, which was good to see because our mallard production earlier in July was not good. So later in July, we did have quite a few ducks, including dabbling ducks, do quite well. So that's a good bonus to add on to what we saw in July, which wasn't really that great. Canada geese across the state continue to do pretty well. Their breeding population has come down a little bit in recent years, which is kind of what we'd like to see. However, with it being kind of a cold, dry spring to start off with, it took a while for them to get going. But once we got all the rain in the eastern part of the state, those geese got going pretty good with their nesting activities. And production for Canada geese in the eastern half of the state was quite good this year. So large type Canada geese around the state should be abundant for hunters this fall. We've also got pretty good reports out of the Arctic as well for Arctic nesting geese like white fronts, little cackling geese, and of course mid-continent light geese, which includes snow geese and Ross's geese. For the most part, spring was pretty early in those Arctic nesting areas, and reports from crews across the Arctic suggest that production was good this year. Most areas had good to above average production, with some areas maybe struggling a little bit, but for the most part, Arctic geese production should be pretty good. So when hunters are getting ready for coming to field this fall, they need to make sure they're HIP registered in North Dakota as part of their license purchasing process. The other cool thing we have going on now is that the federal duck stamp laws have changed. So when you purchase an electronic duck stamp for your license, it'll be valid for the entire season. It won't expire after 45 days like it used to. And then physical stamps will actually be mailed in March after all migratory bird hunting seasons have concluded. So you will be able to receive your physical duck stamp. And then in addition, if you wish to purchase any additional physical duck stamps, you can go to the Amplex website and buy them directly from Amplex, and they'll ship them out to you. One change we also made with regulations was to make our crane hunting hours the same as goose hunting hours. So till 2 most days of the week, except now you can hunt cranes like geese until sunset on Wednesdays and Saturdays. For our species-specific regulations on ducks this year, we don't have any changes to bag limits. Conditions this fall for hunting and being afield are going to be pretty interesting. Like I mentioned, we've had a lot of rain in the eastern half of the state. There's going to be a lot of really oddball wet areas. Some of those areas are going to be a little bit concealed by stubble and crop residue, so hunters really need to be cautious traveling off-road this year and paying attention to conditions afield, not only for wetness, but in some cases dryness. The western half of the state is drying up quite a bit, and there are fire hazards as well, with taller vegetation being around, especially where people are parking vehicles and things like that. They need to be aware of fire risks. And that, of course, will happen in the eastern part of the state where it's been wet too, as that rank vegetation dries down. Hunters going afield need to be aware of, conditions that present risks to their safety, whether they're going out in larger duck boats or smaller watercraft, making sure that they have their appropriate personal flotation devices and being aware of risks of hypothermia, things like that. We always want to make sure that people are also paying attention to A&S regulations as well. That's aquatic nuisance species. Being sure to clean off all of their gear when leaving wetlands, including like decoys, decoy lines, decoy bags or waders, any of that, so they're not transporting any type of vegetation or biota out of wetlands. Abundant wetland conditions this year could make things a little tough actually for waterfowl hunters, with duck numbers being a little bit on the lower side. Ducks might be a little bit spread out. However, there's always good opportunities to be found. The really good opportunities just might be a little bit fewer and farther between. Of course, in the western half of the state, Hunters should be prepared to see drying in wetlands, which may present issues with mud margins between water and emergent vegetation.